What do you know about the Isle of Man? Well, I didn't know much either until I recently found out that Starlink has set up a ground station on this tiny island. Take a look at this map. The Isle of Man is a tiny island in the Irish Sea. It's a British Crown dependency that sits in the middle of the sea, 32 miles long, 13 miles wide, and it's roughly equidistant from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. So why is this important? Starlink already has ground stations in Buckinghamshire and Cornwall. So basically having this ground station on that tiny island will allow them to provide blanket coverage for Britain. So why do I bring this up? Well, you can see the ground station located here on this Starlink satellite tracking map. You may already be familiar with this site, starlink.sx, and it is a very interactive live tracker of all of the Starlink satellites. So I decided to reach out to the guy who created this crazy map that you see. His name is Mike Puchol, and we had a Zoom call. He's in Spain, so that was fun to set up. Time zones are really cool to navigate around. But we had a really great conversation about why he made this map in the first place and more about how it works. And he has some great insight too about, following the coverage as Starlink continues to roll out around the globe. So here's some of our conversation.
What got you interested in, I mean, this sounds like it was a lot of work to create this map and keep it ongoing. So what made you do this?
So I actually started tracking Loon, the Google X project that was supposed to give internet access through helium balloons floating in the stratosphere. So I got interested in that technology. I mean, my day job is I'm the CTO of an ISP based in Kenya, in Africa. So we're on the lookout for all sorts of new technologies that may arrive. We are a wireless ISP, so we deliver wireless service, but we're also on the lookout for satellite-based connectivity. Balloons, satellites,
right?
Carrier pigeons. So whatever comes along that may help us, we keep an eye out. So we had been tracking Loon for a while, and when they actually started launching commercial service, one of the countries they actually started in was Kenya. So I got quite interested in how they were, deploying the balloons, getting them to Kenya, and then actually making them float around. And I actually had written an article about them about 5 years ago, where I was a bit doubtful of the viability based on the parameters back in those days, which was you launch a balloon, it flies across a country, and then it drops down again, and then you have to refill, ship it back to the beginning, refill it, launch it again, and then it does that again. So, I estimated for somewhere like India, the cost of helium alone was something like $800 million a year. Just for the helium to keep the balloons going. So factor in all the operational costs and the hardware costs and everything else. From then, they had progressed significantly. They were able to actually launch a balloon and then sort of keep it floating around more or less the same area based on wind changes at different altitudes. So they would raise the balloon and the wind was going this way, then they would go, I want to go the other way. They would lower the balloon until they hit the wind going the other direction. So they were able to actually keep the balloons more or less in the same area. So I actually built a tracker for Loon back then, which was a way of sort of visualizing how they were providing service and basically analyzing, is this actually something viable? Is it providing meaningful service on the ground? Once they are floating in an area, are they actually moving a lot? If I'm a customer, am I going to see a balloon and then it's going to disappear for an hour and then come back?
Right.
How spotty is it going to be? So all of these parameters, I actually built a tracker for that. And you can actually see all the balloons moving about and, the different altitudes and all of this. And I started writing a couple of articles on the, 5-year progression of Loon. And then they went bust. So,
right.
They ceased service. They shut the company down. And that was the end of it. And then I thought, well, I mean, it's not like I thought, what am I going to do with this tracker? It's more, I actually started getting interested in Starlink when they started launching commercial service. And then I thought, well, I saw a few of the trackers that were out there, and I didn't I didn't find anything that was actually suitable for actually learning how they would operate, how would they provide service to a ground terminal.
Right.
The same sort of analysis I had been doing for Loon, but for Starlink. So I decided to basically recycle the tracker that I had built for Loon and sort of shift its purpose to Starlink. And that's how it got started, really. So I mean, it's not like I started from scratch. I had a base. I had something to base it on. But from then it was about, instead of balloons, you're picking up TLEs that give you the orbital parameters, and then you can see where the satellites are in real time. And then it was about digging into FCC filings, for example, to figure out the spot beams, the shape of the spot beam on the ground, and how it changes in shape and size as the satellites move overhead.
Right.
I did something around the hexagonal grid system. And they have not published how they generate those hex cells, or what the map of cells actually is. But what I found out was the H3 system that Uber developed for their internal system for assigning drivers to riders and so on. They actually developed a hex system that is basically the whole world is covered in a hexagonal cell system that you can change the size of. So you can basically have a map of huge cells, and then each of those huge cells has smaller cells and smaller cells and smaller cells. And there is one particular size which is very close to Starlink's own cell system. It doesn't align perfectly in terms of where they are on the ground or how they're oriented, but they're actually fairly similar. So that also allowed me to build hex cell maps to more or less see how the spot beam actually covers one cell and all the contiguous cells. So it was more about learning. So I'm not the driver for building the tracker. Is not really there isn't any business interest, or there isn't any commercial interest. It's more about learning how it all operates, how it all works, and as part of that, I'm a fairly sort of visual, hands-on type of person. So I basically just put it together and started adding features to it, so I could. It was primarily for my own benefit, but I thought, why not just put it out there and let people use it?
Right. And remind me what your job title is, because it cut out a little bit. You said you work in Kenya?
Yeah. I'm CTO, I was a Chief Technical Officer at a wireless ISP in Kenya.
What is it called?
Wireless ISP. It's called POA Internet.
Okay.
The company name is POA, POA.
POA. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. It cut out a little bit, so I want to make sure I got that out of the way. So, for the lay person who, maybe isn't so educated in what they're looking at on your map, how could you explain how, they can use your map and how it might benefit them?
Okay, so for a lay person, what you can achieve with a map is, it's not so much if you have coverage already. So if you're in an area that is already covered by Starlink in terms of their offering commercial service, and you can order service, you're pretty much in the, if I don't have any obstructions, then my service is going to work more or less okay. So it's not so much that you can base your purchasing decisions on, I set my home location and then it tells me that it's all green and it's got lots of satellites, and I'm gonna order. You shouldn't really do that, because only Starlink knows their own operational parameters on where there is service and where there isn't. And I have seen the odd post on Reddit where someone goes, oh wait, Starlink SX shows that I'm covered and I have lots of satellites all the time, and why am I not getting my dish? Well, that's because Starlink's it's Starlink's own decision as to where and how they operate the service. What it can do is in areas where there isn't service. So for example, you can experiment by placing your home location in the equatorial plane and then adding temporary gateways so that the satellites actually have somewhere to link to, which are fake, but they actually provide a simulation of what would happen if I put certain gateway locations in different areas, and you could simulate what the service would look like. For example, I simulated adding Starlink gateways in the same 3 locations in Kenya where Loon had their own ground stations, So Loon actually had 3 gateways, and they look very similar. They're sort of white mushroom antennas. They used 4 of them. So if you place gateway locations in the same place as Loon did, what would service look like in Kenya? And you could see a heat map of where the service would actually be better or worse, and where you may be able to get service by just having those gateways. So it allows you to basically play around with different things. For example, one thing that Dishy doesn't do is it doesn't tilt east or west. It just tilts north or south. And most customers in the northern hemisphere, it tilts north. So you can, in the tracker, you can actually tilt east or west. So you can actually simulate if I'm, for example, on the east coast of the United States, where satellites, as they move off the coast, eventually they lose gateway connectivity. What would happen if I turn my dish towards the west to face, to concentrate the antenna focus more on the satellites that are actually coming over the horizon? How would that change my service or my expected service parameters? So it's all about, first of all, being able to visualize the status of the Starlink constellation. So, how many satellites are operational? Are the orbital planes actually filled? So there's a sort of more nerdy, geeky aspect to it. But to the layperson that says, how could I use this? It's more about, find where you live on the map, put the home location there. The default settings that the tracker then applies, such as the dish tilt, are going to be more or less accurate as to what the real dish would do. And then it's just observe. So, see how many satellites are going over your location, how much time do you have a link from one satellite versus multiple satellites. And if you're in an area that doesn't have gateways, then place a few gateways randomly and see how that affects service on your particular location. Technically, if you had enough gateways all over the globe, the Starlink satellites would have continuous coverage everywhere. So you're restricting factor to get service. For example, here in Spain, we don't have any gateways in Spain yet. However, there is a gateway just in sort of across the border in France. There is a gateway that could potentially enable Starlink satellites to serve the north of Spain. What happens is the further south you go, the less likely you are to have a satellite going overhead that has a link to one of these French stations. What you can do is, if you could say, well, I'm guessing that Starlink is going to place a gateway in Madrid, which is one of the major internet nodes, or maybe Barcelona. So, let me place a gateway in Madrid and see what happens. And if I'm down south in the south of Spain and I place a gateway in Madrid, that is no longer my restricting factor in terms of simulating what my service would be like. So that is the purpose of placing these gateways. It's not necessarily to say, definitely by placing a temporary gateway on the map, Starlink is not going to put one there. But what you do is you take away the effect of not having gateways. And if you don't have a gateway, then a satellite going overhead or passing nearby, you cannot give you service.
Right.
And that's what the tracker assumes. The tracker assumes that a satellite that is visible to you is only able to give you service if itself has a gateway connection.
Right. Have you plotted the active gateways, or someone needs to do that themselves?
So I have plotted the active gateways that we know about. I know that there are gateways that we don't know about. And this is one of those Donald Rumsfeld moments when he said we know the things that we know, but we don't know the things that we don't know that we know that we don't know, or something along those lines. So we know that there are gateways that we know about, and we know that there are gateways that we don't know about. For example, we suspect there are gateways in Austria, but the Austrian regulator doesn't publish those online. Same as the Spanish regulator doesn't publish the location of gateway stations. So there isn't a public licensing website you can go like with the FCC, for example, or Australia, for example, Canada, the UK, Ireland. So all those countries have public databases where whenever you apply for a gateway license, that gets published and you get the actual coordinates of where it is. So whenever anybody finds one of these, and they pop up on Reddit, and there's people always on the lookout for them. I basically add them to the tracker, and whenever you reload the page, you will have the new stations. Just a few days ago, 3 more stations were added to Australia, for example, and there was one gateway in Canada, in Saguenay, or Séguéné, or French. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, but there was a gateway added there recently, a few months ago, but it was hotly debated because it wasn't on the licensing database. But there were some people that said, no, I actually know that they're building something there, but I can't really say much. And eventually it was confirmed. So it came up on the Canada's licensing website, and then I actually added it to the map. So that's the way it works in terms of my tracker. Is whenever I get a report of new gateways added, I add them to the map. But if you know that there are gateways in Austria, you could basically put one in Vienna, and see how that affects performance and coverage.
Right. So another question that I get asked a lot is, when is it going to come to my area, and when will we have global coverage? So just from your observations, what have you noticed with areas that are new where it's in, and how soon will we get that, do you think?
So what I think is that this first generation of Starlink is going to be somewhat restricted in the capability, in the capacity to provide service to multiple areas. I think people have an expectation as to, well, it's coming, it's going to be live, and we live in a world where, when Apple releases the new iPhone, you can get it immediately anywhere. Back in the day, you used to have to queue up in the Apple stores and, camp outside for days and whatnot. And then they would have a shortage of 6 months until there were more iPhones. But these days it's like, well, I want it that way. Why is it not available in my area? There are reasons that have to do with the actual capacity of the satellite constellation as is. Each satellite has 3 antennas for the satellite to customer link portion, and so 3 antennas that actually beam down towards the customers. That's where you need most bandwidth, because people download more than upload. So they have a 3-to-1. Let's say they have 3 transmit antennas towards the ground and 1 receive antenna for customer traffic upwards, and then they have 2 antennas that actually link to the gateways. So they can actually link each satellite to 2 gateways. They use that so that you have, as you move, you have contact with 1 gateway. But before, if you only had 1 antenna and you were pointed at 1 gateway, and then you said, "Oh, I'm losing contact with this gateway," the time it takes to actually move the antenna and point it, this is actually a dish, so it's not a phase array. The time it takes to actually move the dish to the new gateway and establish the new connection with the new gateway, that is a time when when customers couldn't be sending traffic. Right. Because there's no link to the gateway. So one reason is they basically go, right, I'm before I break this one, this is called make before break. So I make this link before I break this one. And it also means that I can be actually connected to 2 gateways at the same time, and I have redundancy, or I have more capacity to serve customer traffic. But in any case, what their limit is they have these 3 antennas. Between them, they can project 48 what's called spot beams, and a spot beam covers, at any given moment, covers 1 single cell. So you can imagine a satellite having 48 flashlights and basically shining these 48 flashlights at different locations on the ground as they get covered. There is one feature on the tracker. If you click on a satellite and leave it selected, it will actually plot the hex cells under the satellite's footprint. You can then imagine, if it has to serve all those hex cells underneath its footprint with 48 of these flashlights, it's a lot of cells. So you can only basically train them enough time to serve customers meaningfully. If it had to serve, if we say it's 8,000 cells and you only have 48 of these beams, each cell would only get a very, very small amount of time of beam time, which means it would only have a very short time to actually download data to customers on that cell. Thereby, the throughput would be severely reduced.
Interesting. So
it's as if you had imagine you have a connection, a fiber connection to your house, and you have it full time, and you get 100 megabits per second, and then suddenly you say, oh, but I need to share it with my neighbors, but the only way to share it is to actually unplug the fiber and plug it into the other 3 houses. Right. Imagine you could do this instantaneously, right? You would basically unplug from your house, and then for a quarter of a for a quarter of a second, 250 milliseconds, you plug it to one neighbor, then second neighbor, third neighbor, back to yourself, first neighbor. So you're basically sharing a quarter of the time of those 100 megabit per second, meaning each one of you would effectively get 25 megabits per second. So if you imagine the satellite is able to provide, let's say 20 gigabits per second, split among 48 spot beams, split among the whole footprint of the satellite, you can see how this is starts being an issue. The density of satellites is then what counts. So if you then have multiple satellites all covering the same cell, you can basically have one single spot beam over that cell for a longer period of time because the cell next to it is served by a different satellite.
Right.
And this is why, as they increment the density of the shells, they're going to start providing more and more service to more and more customers.
Interesting. So even though you might see in your area there are satellites that could cover you, there's like a capacity for how many customers they can serve.
Correct.
Makes sense.
So the way they're going to plan this is they're going to say a particular cell is going to be covered by so many satellites during a period of time. I'm able to train a spot beam from all these satellites for so much time to this particular cell, which means that I can only serve so many customers in this cell if I want to give them a target bandwidth.
Right.
And this is a key factor. They could serve a lot more customers if they said, well, I'm only going to give you 3 or 4 Mbps. I could serve a lot more customers. You're only going to get 3 or 4 Mbps. If you want to give them 100 Mbps, you can serve a lot less customers with the same amount of bandwidth and the same amount of satellite capacity.
How much time does it take you to keep this tracker active?
Not much, because the tracker itself runs client side, so there's no server side. There's nothing running on the server other than the actual code itself that you download into your browser. Once it's on your browser, it's actually running on your computer on your own machine. So it's not really consuming resources on my server other than the traffic to, serve all these files. And then in terms of time, it's fairly bursty. So for example, I haven't really done much with it for 2-3 weeks now, other than update gateways and whatnot.
Right.
But for example, when I added the polar plots, the orbital plane plots, for example, that was a few hours of basically putting the charts together, writing the code to actually represent the orbital planes and where the satellites are in each plane and so on. So it basically comes and goes. The other one I thought to do was the weather patterns. So and this is only US now because it's the only country with a decent weather service public server where you can actually pull rain maps and cloud maps and so on. So I saw people posting on Starlink, oh, I'm being affected by rain and whatnot. So I thought, why not add the rain, the sort of the weather radar rain plot on the map, and that one, for example, took about half an hour because it's basically write a piece of code that plugs the data from NOAA's servers and just plots it on the map. That's it. So some things are more difficult than others.
Well, I feel like the other thing, is that the coverage isn't instantaneous, right? Like the satellites take a bit to get into the orbit that they need to be in to provide coverage.
Yes. So the way you can do the way you put satellites into specific orbits, you can do it two ways in principle. One is to launch directly into the orbit that you want to launch at, but that means that you need to launch from very specific places on the Earth, and above and below the equator. You can also launch from anywhere and then use a lot of fuel to maneuver yourself to the right orbit, to the right orbital plane. So there's three ways actually, and the third one is Starlink does it, which is I'm just going to put all the satellites into a certain orbital plane, and then I'm going to let the Earth's precession, so the Earth's own movement, actually take care of slowly shifting the satellites into the right place, and then I'm going to play with raising them and lowering them, which changes their speed in order to place them within the actual orbital planes that they want. So they do this combination of raising and lowering combined with Earth's own motion, and it just means you need to wait longer. So they have satellites that have been there for 2-3 months, that are still basically being transitioned into the final orbital planes.
So these next generation, they're going to have those like interlaser links. Do you think that once
Yep.
we have that, more fully integrated coverage will be pretty seamless?
So I think one thing that we need to consider is that the intersatellite links are not they're not magic links that allow you to provide coverage everywhere, because you still need a gateway to download the traffic onto. So you still need to have one satellite in the orbital plane, and I am making the calculated guess that the intersatellite links actually link to satellites in front and behind for now. So they don't actually have lasers on gimbals that can actually link to any satellite in any of the orbits. I mean, so if you look on the tracker, you will see that each orbital plane has basically a chain of satellites that are basically moving one after the other.
Yeah.
So the way to logically link this without spending lots of money on very expensive gimbal heads and tracking systems is to basically make your laser only point forward and a laser pointing backward, and you basically link to the satellite in front and the satellite behind. And then if you as you have one orbital plane that covers the entire Earth, the entire 360 degrees, as long as you have one satellite in that orbital plane that has a gateway link, all the other satellites potentially have a link,
right,
through this laser link through to that gateway. What we need to consider, however, is that if that is one gateway link, if you have 20 satellites or 22 satellites on that plane, the traffic from those 22 satellites need to go through one single ground link. Yeah, which is not very practical. So then you either have 20 satellites each with 1/20th of the usual bandwidth that you would have if you only had one satellite connected to a gateway and then a bunch of customers connected to that satellite. Now you need to have this satellite relaying the traffic for its own customers, but also for the customers from the other 19 satellites, around the same orbital plane. So the intersatellite links will serve. They have stated that they're going to focus them on polar orbits. That's because placing gateways anywhere for further north than 55-60 degrees is a bit hard, because you basically don't have fiber. You don't have a lot of fiber in the North Pole and in the polar regions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult to basically build gateways in those areas. So it makes sense to have these polar shells that are basically linked via laser links in between the satellites, and then eventually to a gateway somewhere below 55-60 degrees. So they're not magical. They're not going to solve all the problems, and they're not going to provide global connectivity per se. They will allow the Starlink to provide connectivity in areas where currently there isn't, and where currently they couldn't provide connectivity because there's lack of gateways. So potentially they could say, if there is made up example, if they have a research base in the Arctic that has no connectivity, they could say, well, I'm going to give service just to this station in the Arctic, and I'm going to give them 100 Mbps, which is peanuts. That I can relay through 3 or 4 satellites eventually to a gateway link, and it doesn't really affect performance of the entire shell. It's a different story from saying I am going to have all 20 satellites in the entire orbital plane providing service through one single satellite connected to a gateway. That is a more unrealistic scenario.
Are you seeing a lot more ground stations be built?
Yes. The key to start, so the limiting capacity eventually is going to be ground stations, because that's where you need to concentrate your traffic, you need to aggregate your traffic, and you eventually need tens and hundreds of gigabits per second of fiber capacity that is connected to major internet backbones, and those are not everywhere.
Right.
And you cannot, and the thing is, you cannot co-locate hundreds of antennas on one site to serve satellites. A, because you can only see so many satellites, and B, because you're going to have so much interference in the available spectrum that you're not going to be able to operate efficiently. So there's going to be spectrum constraints. I have a theory that is Starlink will eventually, not with the current constellation, but with the new shells that are going to be coming up, and with generation 2 satellites and onwards, I think they're going to start relying on laser laser ground satellite to ground links. And those can be, hundreds of gigabits per second with basically zero interference other than clouds.
Right.
But what you can do once you have inter-satellite links on a full orbital plane, if you have one region of the Earth which has clouds, 3 times a year, you basically put a big laser ground station at that location, and that can be multiple, hundreds of gigabits per second up to a single satellite. And then the inter-satellite links can also have multiple, hundreds of gigabits per second going around the entire plane. And then that constraint that I mentioned in the current architecture is no longer there, which is the single gateway to the ground. So my prediction is that they will eventually move away from radio-based ground links, gateway links. Customer links will still be radio, but links for the actual gateways will be laser, will be optical links.
After seeing Loon fail, what do you think about Starlink and its future long term?
So the issue Loon had, in my view, was it was providing LTE service to customers on the ground for existing LTE network or LTE operator customers. So, for example, Kenya has an operator called Telkom. They're the third operator in terms of customer volumes, and they have a footprint in Kenya. What Loon was doing was basically filling the gaps in the coverage for that operator. The issue Loon had, and it was operating in the stratosphere, so 20, 30 kilometers up in the air, was that in terms of LTE, 30 kilometers is basically the edge of a macro ground cell. So if you turn it sideways and you have a tower, 30 kilometers away from the tower is more or less the maximum you can get away with in LTE. So they were basically doing this in this direction. This also means that indoor coverage was not possible. So Loon couldn't actually provide indoor coverage. It was only outdoor coverage. So you had to actually be, without trees or houses in a way. So it had constraints and limitations. It was also only able to use maximum 20 megahertz of LTE spectrum, which means that the entire massive footprint of a balloon was only able to provide 20 megahertz worth of LTE capacity, which in more or less standard LTE is about 150 Mbps, 300 Mbps if you're in sort of MIMO type architectures. But 300 Mbps on a huge ground footprint, it's not a lot. Once you have a lot of customers on that, you're not going to get a really good experience. So the types of customers that are going to be able to pay for that service in rural, in the outdoors, so actually, I'm sat outside, I'm actually getting service, they're not going to be using gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes of traffic. As if I put my sort of wireless ISP hat on, we saw that when we started providing home service instead of sort of street hotspot service, that's when customers started using data, and customers in their homes consuming tens and hundreds of gigabytes a month. Whereas, on a Wi-Fi hotspot on the street, what are you going to use? 1 gigabyte, maybe a couple of gigabytes per week, because you can't really do. You're going to watch a movie on YouTube for 2 hours sat on the street. And then and in those 2 hours the balloon could basically float away. So Starlink, I think, has nailed several of those issues. One is the bandwidth. So they have massive amounts of bandwidth compared to something like Loon. So they're actually able to serve with meaningful capacity and very good latencies. Secondly, they are always overhead. So they've always got a satellite overhead. You're no longer depending on where the winds are blowing your balloons. You have a very predictable satellite coverage pattern. And if there's one thing that customers hate is lack of predictability in their service. I remember a friend of mine used to run a satellite operator, sort of the ground side. So they would actually install satellite dishes for satellite internet service. And they said it was actually curious because customers knew that when there was thunderstorms, the service would go off. But it was easy because you'd go, well, is there a thunderstorm? Yeah, that's why my internet is off. The issue is when customers when the internet goes off and you don't know why, that's when you start getting really annoyed and you get really angry customers. It's when it's unpredictable and it's, oh, what's happened? Oh, the balloon has floated off. oh, try to explain that to a customer.
Right.
With Starlink is very predictable. They're able to very accurately predict in this particular ground location, you're going to have 99.9% service time or 98%. So they're able to give you a figure, which is good, and they're even able to tell you what times a day, based on the completion of the orbital planes, you're going to have outages. When all the orbital planes are full and everything is in place, that is going to be, everything is going to be equal. So if you have service, you're going to have service. It's no longer a case of during certain times of the day when the orbital planes that are empty are actually above you. Those are times when you have less satellite serving you, and when you can have, for example, more chances for obstructions.
Do you have feedback that a lot of people are using your tracker, and also have people reached out to you with like a similar question?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of questions. I've also had input from people a lot more knowledgeable than I am. So people that obviously work in the space industry or the satellite industry, or they design antennas for a living. So I've had a lot of feedback and comments and input. But I've also had lots of questions. I've even had a customer question. So someone actually reached out to me and said, I ordered mid-March, can you please tell me when I'm going to get service, as if I had anything to do with Starlink or SpaceX. So I actually referred them back to to the SpaceX website, to the Starlink website, and asked them to get in touch with them. But I do have, every so often I have feedback from people asking questions. It's interesting that I don't get a lot of emails saying when am I going to get my dish, which is I'm thankful for. So most of the feedback is actually useful, positive, and welcome. So
yeah, I feel like a lot of people that watch my videos, they ask me that, when am I going to get my dish? I put in my pre-order.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's nobody really. I mean, the only people that know is SpaceX.
Right.
They know the plans. I know there's a lot of people that have been seeing changes in their orders from sort of mid 2021 or late 2021. They're now going into it's 2022 now, and I think this is because Starlink has based on and Starlink or SpaceX is a company that moves fast, breaks things, learns a lot on the go, and they don't spend a lot of time planning, and they spend a lot more time doing. I think that's part of their success, because a lot of companies that have been trying to do this have failed because they spend years and years planning and designing and getting stuff built by consortiums of companies, and eventually they've launched stuff but eventually run out of money and failed. So they've been moving a lot faster. That has benefits, but it also has drawbacks in that your assumptions and your calculations sometimes once you start putting things out there in the market, they become you need to fine tune them, and you start learning things that you didn't really know when you were planning things, and you need to adjust service parameters and people's expectations as a result. So I think people that are getting my orders now been delayed to next year is basically because SpaceX has realized that in order to provide decent service, they need to span the order flow out over a longer period of time.
Right. Man, I feel like we've covered a lot. Are you wanting a Starlink eventually?
Yes, so I have actually ordered two. One for this place where I'm now, which is the one that needs it most, and one for my place in Barcelona. I mean, I have fiber there, but it was more let me order two and see which one comes first once they start service. I've heard that Spain was going to get service sometime sort of late July, early August, and it was more an issue around getting the licensing in place and so on. So I'm still waiting, but I'm hopeful that it's going to be soon enough. So
yeah,
but yeah, and I have a bunch of things that I'm going to be doing to my dish once it arrives.
Like what?
So, for example, one example is I'm going to freeze water discs of different thicknesses and place them on the dish to see how water attenuates the signal. and how it affects the signal levels, because this is something that we don't really know. We know that people have complained that in the rain it's been really bad. Other people have complained that in the rain it's been doing great. And this really has to do with the thickness of the water column that is between you and the satellite, basically. Because you may be under a really thick column of rain, like really heavy thunderstorm, but if it's really narrow and your signal is going in this direction, it's only, it's 500 meters out. It's basically out of the rain and no longer being affected by water. If you're in the middle of a squall of, big long string of thunderstorms and general rain, the amount of water your signal has to go through is a lot higher, which means your signal is a lot more attenuated, and that's maybe where your service is poor. You can simulate this by basically saying, I'm going to freeze a disk of water 3 centimeters thick. This simulates a thunderstorm of X intensity. You place that on a dish, and then you see how your signal level varies. It's interesting how the marketing works, because this snow melting mode thingy that they've always mentioned is literally the dish is detecting that the signal levels are lower, so it increases power, which means the whole thing heats up as a result, and thereby, if there's snow on the dish, it melts.
Interesting. Huh.
So it's not that it has a magical capacity of detecting snow. All it's doing, it's saying my signal level is lower. If I have a satellite in this position and I have no obstructions, I can very much calculate to a very accurate degree how many dBs of signal strength I should be receiving. If I'm getting less, but I'm still getting a link, it means that I'm not obstructed. If I'm getting 0, maybe there's a tree in the way. If I'm getting something less, it means that maybe there's something in the way. If that something is constant as I move, as the satellite moves, and I'm getting a constant level of reduction of signal, maybe that's because I have a bunch of snow on top of me. Right. What do? I increase the power levels, I generate more heat, I melt the snow, the problem goes away.
Gotcha.
As soon as I detect that the power levels are back to normal, I know that the snow is gone.
Right. Well, I know some people have had the problem opposite of the thing overheating and shutting down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very power hungry. I mean, one of the things that really surprised me was the amount of power that it draws. And it was over 100 watts, which is really high. I mean, the radios that we have serving anywhere up to 150 customers. So we basically have these towers, and we have these radios in sort of unlicensed spectrum around the tower, and each of these radios is serving a number of customers with their own little dish pointed at the tower. Each of the radios is taking 8 to 10 watts. Wow. And they're serving 150 customers. And the dish in the customer's house is taking maybe 5 or 6 watts. So 100 plus watts is a significant amount of power.
Yeah.
So that was one of the things that surprised me. But I'm guessing that will eventually progress. And I know that people have opened up newer hardware revisions of the dish, and the number of chips on the actual circuit board has reduced significantly.
Interesting.
Which technically should amount to more to less power being used. So there was one interesting thing that we found out from the telemetry of the dish, was that it provided the satellite IDs, but it also provided the gateway IDs. And the gateway at the bottom of each of the mushrooms, there is actually a sticker that says SX ID and the number. We suspect that those gateway IDs are what the dish was reporting as the gateway through which you were being served. So you had a satellite ID, and then you had a gateway ID. And when I watched your video, I was like, show me the bottom of the mushrooms. Show me the bottom of the mushrooms. You know that video you did with the in front of one of the gateways.
Yes.
And I was like, well, yeah, put the camera underneath. Show me a bit more. Peek over it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we have tried to get people to sort of if they have a gateway nearby, to actually send us the IDs just to verify whether the numbers are actually the same. But they've actually turned off that telemetry now, so we cannot get the satellite IDs anymore. So
why would that be so useful?
It would be useful for a competitor to in order to see how much time each satellite is serving which locations, and they could gather they could be, and I think SpaceX is extra cautious because they have a lot of hate, I would say, and it's no longer. I don't classify it as competition because it's not really fair. So Viasat is throwing everything at them, environmental concerns and all kinds of things, and I think they're basically being, they're being unfair. They're no longer on the, I'm a competitor and I am using, competitive tactics to, try to, be better than you or win over customers or whatever. It's more, I'm trying to shut you down because I see you as a competitor, and I'm going to try to do it, with every, tool in the chest, no matter how, no matter how twisted that tool is or, how you present the information. So I guess what they saw is, if someone grabs this information, they could actually twist it, and, present it in a way that is, at least would cause the FCC to go, wait, what? Can you explain this?
Right.
So, I guess out of precaution, it's a bit of information that, a customer would normally not need.
Right.
So they basically just turned it off.
So again, if you're unfamiliar with the site, it's just starlink.sx. I'll put a link in the description. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like. And if you're new to the channel, make sure to hit subscribe. I want to know from you, did you already know about this website, or is this something that you might want to explore now? Again, super easy to find and hopefully pretty easy for you to navigate. But I thought it was really interesting to hear from Mike about kind of, his background with starting the site for Google Loon and then, it evolving into what it is today. So really cool to see more and more areas getting Starlink, and, love hearing from you guys. So make sure to leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you soon.